Oh, hi. I'm Marc, an art teacher, a professional artist. And in this week's video, I'm going to show you all the steps that I take to bring my paintings from pretty good to done, final, ship it. I get a ton of questions about that final part of the process. And so it's time for another episode of my ongoing weekly series, YouTube Art School. Let's see how it's done. All right, take a seat. Class is in session. So one of the questions that keep coming back here on YouTube, and something that I actually spend a lot of time discussing with my students, is how to finish a painting. When is it done? Of course, every artist is different, but what I'm going to show you today are the 5 steps that I usually take with my own paintings before I consider them done and ready to be posted online. You can think of them as the 5 steps that will add the wow ingredient to your painting. Well, hopefully at least. Now, if your issue is not what to do to finalize a painting, to fully render it out and call it done, but everything that comes before that, or maybe you have issues with some of the steps, sketching, line quality, shading, lighting, backgrounds, colors, composition, don't worry, I got you. You'll be able to find links to all of these things down in the description below. So I'll be showing the steps in the exact same order that I usually tackle them. So first, we'll take a look at the materials in our scene. So making sure that, the different objects look like what they should be. So if something is meant to be shiny and metallic, well, it looks that way. If something else is supposed to be matte / non-reflective, making sure that we have that variety. Second, we'll take a look at lights and shadows. And this is my favorite because this one really changes the painting a lot. You can take almost any painting, even bad ones, and by simply just having good lights and shadow in your scene, flip it around and make it look awesome. You'll see. Third, we'll take a look at particles, or like effects, to give a little bit of motion to our scene, a little extra dynamism. And then the final 2 steps are going to be pretty quick in comparison. We'll take a look at contrast and brightness to make sure that the final image is as dialed in as it can possibly be. And then the final step, very quickly, we'll just add a little bit of vignette effect to our final image to help focus the eye of the viewer towards the center of the piece. Oh, and as a bonus, I'll also show you how to add a little bit of chromatic aberration effect to your painting to give your colors a little kick and make them just a little bit more vibrant. So there we have it. Let's get started. You'll be able to find all the different steps split up as chapters on the timeline to better navigate to what you need. Now, let's take over this painting over here and get it to a good starting point so that we can add the final polish. And let's see how it's done. What we got here. So now she's properly dressed. She's got colors and everything. So this, this is something that I would be pretty comfortable, pretty satisfied with posting online. But this is just a character. It's not a full painting. So real quick, let's just add a little bit of a background. So now let's drop in the character in there. Ooh, doesn't quite work, does it? Feels like she's kind of floating. Let's make a few adjustments. Much better. So this is going to be our starting point. How do we take this painting right here and polish it up some more? Oh, and by the way, if you're wondering what you're looking at right now, well, this is a character from my Chroma Island personal project. This is supposed to be some sort of spell caster from the Laguna tribe. I have a full series about Chroma Island, so you can find a link to that playlist down in the description below. But yeah, I'm happy with this so far. In my opinion, though, it can still get a lot better. Notably, like I just mentioned, by improving the material definition here. So if we zoom in and look around the canvas here, everything is pretty much the same material, kind of like fabric. Now you can kind of disregard the water texture that I have in here. In this case, it doesn't count. But you'll see, it's not as big of an impact as when we turn on the lights, for example, but it really helped to spice things up, as you're about to see here, with highlights, without. Without. It makes it look a lot more 3D, doesn't it? Same thing with her hair, for example. Without, with, without, with. And all of it is managed through this one layer here, the highlight / tint layer, which if I set it to normal mode, looks something like this. Of course, that looks like nothing, but when you set it to hard light mode, everything that's above 50% gray will tend to light up the colors that are underneath, and everything that's darker than 50% gray will darken it. So it gives you a good amount of flexibility with just one layer. And this is really my favorite way to add more material definition. And look at the boots in here, without, with, ooh. Same thing here on the cloak. A few more details too. I added some seams in there. Same thing with our strange shorts. Now the fabric is a little bit more shiny than it used to be. I think it's a nice contrast with the white pants. Now, paired with that layer, I like to have a secondary layer set to the same blending mode that I'll typically use for everything that glows, like anything that emits a small amount of light, not a light source per se, but something that is a little shiny, maybe that glows a little bit like a magic particle, but also the glare that you get when you have a reflection on a very shiny metal. So with the glow on, off, on, off, on. There will be that thing like you can see here around the boots. Very subtle amount of glare. Makes the metal a little shinier. Same thing up here. You can look at the earrings without the glow, with the glow. Same idea. Reinforcing the material. No material definition whatsoever. With material definition. Already much better. Step 1, check. Now let's move on to my favorite part, adding the lights. In our case, today here, we're going to have 3 different light sources. Main light source being the sun itself. We're outside here somewhere on Chroma Island and it's sunny. So sun, first light source. Second light source going to be the sky itself. So much less intense, but a much bigger light source coming from the top. And then finally some bounce light from the main light source. Once again, if this is a little too advanced, you can find a link to my lighting tutorial in the description too. So now, ladies and gentlemen, let's turn on those lights. So we'll start with the light that has the least amount of impact. Now, like I said, not too long ago, light, in my opinion, is something that really changes a lot. It really adds a ton of wow factor to an image, but it's also some of the hardest things to do. Thinking back at all the feedback that I give to my students though, light is probably the topic that comes back the most often, and it's very often the answer to how can I make this look better. So let's activate those lights. Click. You can see here, this is going to be the bounce lights. So just the light bouncing off the ground mostly, which is why you'll be able to observe it down here without, without. Now let's take that away and look at the light from the sky in isolation, just by itself, what it looks like. So my skylight, just like all the other lights, by the way, is set to hard light mode. So just like the previous step, but sometimes if the scene is a little brighter, overlay works really well too. Now for the skylight here, of course, the light's coming from above. And so everything that's facing up will get it. So the top of the legs, the top of the hair, we can see up here, without, with, on the arms, on the chest, on the legs, like I said, on the spell book here too, without, with. But this particular light source, in my opinion, is very important because it really helps to ground your character in the scene. Now, if you just have like a white canvas, if you don't have any background, not as useful, but if your character is part of an environment, you've got to have it. All right, now let's go ahead and turn back the bounce lights. So as you can see, all this lights is really changing the character quite a bit, in my opinion, making it pop a lot more. But we're still missing one light source, the most important one, the most intense of them all, the sun. So let's disable the other two real quick. As you can see here, the character is only partially lit by the sun. You can look at the ground here, we can see the shadow, but only part of the character here is sticking outside of the shadow. So in my case here, the light will only kind of hit the top of the head and top of the torso, but that's it. Should we turn it on? Click. And finally, let's enable all the lights all at once. So here's the difference. No lights with lights. No lights, lights. And yeah, this leads us to the third point, particles or effects. So let's turn it on right here. So in this scene, we have a lot going on, but I'll bring your attention to the smallest of the detail because that's usually what I use it for. So I have all my gems here kind of emitting a little bit of particles. Obviously the main staff got a bunch of particles kind of exploding from its center. Down here we have some water splash. Around the ice shards we have a bunch of little particles of snow. Without, pretty boring. With, there we go, much better. And so yeah, in here it would be kind of anything that's floating in the air, really. So you can see also in the back, without birds, with birds, a lot better. It makes the place feel more alive. You could also have in here pollen particles floating around to give the sense that there's a little bit of a breeze in your scene. In other less dynamic pieces, maybe you want to have dust particles floating in the air to show that the air is a little stale. Pollen, sand, dust, usually the 3 that I keep in mind. In most cases, it's going to be pretty subtle, but it really makes the environment feel more alive. So do it. For the final 2 steps, I'm not going to be painting anything new. So let's just save this whole thing as a JPEG. Let's open up the image here and move on to step number 4, which is going to be to check the brightness and contrast levels in our scene. Now, this is something that with my own students is almost a running gag by now, with just how often this keeps being brought up. What tends to happen is that the image is going to be too dark. Obviously, most people don't have kind of like a screen calibration tool, and everybody's got a bunch of different screens with different settings and different color quality. But here's what I do to ensure that the contrast and brightness and values in general of my piece are correct. First step, usually just to check, I'll go through all 3 options here in Photoshop. So of course this works in Photoshop. If you don't have Photoshop, you can skip that. But let's go through the 3 different ones here. So auto tone. All right, it's darkening things a bit too much in my opinion. So I'm going to undo that. Auto contrast, probably the same thing once again. So a little too much contrast. Now we can try the same thing for color. After, before, after. Here Photoshop is basically suggesting that I warm the colors up a bit more because it's too blue. And I kind of agree with that, although this is too much. Paste it as a separate layer. And then maybe let's try to play with the opacity here. If you find like a middle ground, that's pretty good. Yeah, that is better. So I'm going to go ahead and collapse that, merge the 2. So this is the image with its contrast slightly tweaked. So there you go. If you have this tool, it's a really good way to quickly have a look at your values in general, your colors too, and basically be able to see what Photoshop considers a more balanced image. Obviously, this is made for photos, but it works quite well with paintings too. Now, even if you don't have access to those tools, let's say you're using a different software, you will have access to something like this, curves. So when you open this window, the main thing that you should be looking at right now is this little graph here. You see all the little lines here that are light gray. This represents the spread of your values overall in the painting. And what you see right now is ideal. What you want to avoid is something that is crammed on one side or the other of this graph. So for example, let's damage this image, and this is what we have. So we see here on the left, have a spike. Most of our colors are dark. Now in this particular case, it's very obvious. Now it kind of looks ugly, but in some other cases, it's not as obvious. So always have a look at your curves level, not necessarily to play with the curve itself, but to look at the spread of your values. So once again, something to keep in mind, making sure that all these bars here are not focused on one side or the other, but that they use the whole spectrum of values. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we're ready for the final step of this painting, which is going to be adding a vignette effect. So right now, I'm just doing it manually, but it would be something like this. So without, with, without. As you can see, it tends to help focus the attention towards the center of the canvas. In this case, since I'm using black, you can set it to just normal blend mode or multiply. Doesn't really matter. But if you'd rather not paint it manually, you can always go in Photoshop here, lens correction, and then you can play around here with the vignette sliders. And so this way you can easily darken the edges of your canvas. And this is how tight or soft that spread is. Approved. And now we're done. But wait, there's more. As I mentioned at the beginning here, let's add a chromatic aberration effect to this painting right now. So we're going to go ahead and filters here and go back to lens correction once more, because if we move on to the custom tab here, we'll be able to see that they have chromatic aberration sliders right in there. So super simple. Usually the top one is the best one to use, but you can play around with all of them. And yeah, I'm just going to go ahead and drag it all the way to the left. Now you might not want as much, and depending on the size of your canvas, you won't have to use as much, but my canvas is pretty big, so let's go full power, and I'll do before and after, and you'll see the difference. So you can see here, kind of like a green outline above the eyelashes and a red outline below it. So of course, this is more noticeable when you look at it up close, but from a distance, pretty minor. With, without, with, without. And so this is just a quick little trick that I really like to bring out the colors just a little more, just make them pop just a bit more. What's that? You don't have Photoshop, so you can't do this. I'll show you how to do it manually. So what you can do if you don't have that particular tool, let's say you're using, again, a different software. You just want to go to your layer where you want the chromatic aberration effect. And then we have to go and play with the channels. So here we have the 3 channels that make up this image. But essentially what chromatic aberration is when there's a slight offset between all those channels. So now we can just move the red layer. And when we do, we can just offset them a little bit to get that chromatic aberration effect. Of course, now this is the same thing, but way too much. Move it just a little bit to the side, up and down. So this way you have a few pixels that are green, a few pixels that are red. Same result as what we get by doing just a lens correction here in Photoshop. Yeah, that's it. everything you have to do is just offset one of your channels by a few pixels and you get chromatic aberration. So let's bring back what we had before we started to see the before and after. So that was before. This is where we started, but when we turn these on, much better. Don't you agree? Damn right you agree. Yeah, there you go. I hope that was helpful. If you ever get to this point and you're wondering, what could I do to this to make it pop some more? Now you know. If you try this and you get some pretty decent results, share it with me. I'm always super stoked to see, the art that you guys create as a result of my weekly tutorials. So yeah, don't hesitate to tag me on social media, Twitter, Instagram mostly. I'll often reshare it when you do so. Why not? Free traffic. Free? Talking about free, you can also grab my brushes for free up here in the top right corner of the screen, many of which that I used for this painting here. That's it for today. Make sure you come back next Friday for another free video tutorial, but it's only free if you're a subscriber. If you're not a subscriber yet and you're an artist, I'm gonna have to call the poll.